Good morning, class, and welcome to lecture series part 3 of the cell, the basic building block of life, the amazing things that are put together to make you a living thing, your dog a living thing, and that spider that's under your foot right now. Oh my God, the spider. Last lecture, we talked just quickly about the size of cells, the different types of cells, and cell differentiation. And if you remember right, I want you to know differentiation. If you didn't get that in the last lecture, let's put that in our science notebook under our notes. Differentiation is a cell has the ability to become many different types of cells within the body. And by types of cells, maybe it's a muscle cell, a neuron cell, a blood cell, just all different types of cells. Every cell has the information on how to become any cell. And therefore, there is a possibility they could become that cell. Most of the time, there's mechanisms to keep it so, my eyeball cell doesn't start growing like hair. That would be really bad, and it could happen under cancer, but we'll get to that later in the year. The different types of cells we talked about were prokaryotic cells. So those are very, very simple cells. Bacteria are these. They don't have all these organelles we're going to talk about today. And then eukaryotic cells are the kinds of cells we're going to talk about today, and they're going to have all these organelles you see in this cell in the background. Eukaryotic cells are then broken down into, are they plant, animal, or fungi? And there's slight differences between those, but really they have mostly the same organelles. So you guys have a note sheet that you've been given. I would probably like you to write this in your notebook first as we go through each one, and then later on you'll transfer it into that note sheet to help keep things organized. Some of you may just use the note sheet for this one. So let's dive into the organelles of the cell. This will be part 1. It'll probably take us 2 lectures. First, kind of mentioned this before, but we really haven't written it down. What is an organelle? They're tiny parts of the cell that do jobs to make a cell work. So I like to think of a cell as like a city. And in order for a city to function, we have to have different things going on in the city. We probably need a group of people who have been hopefully elected, at least in our case, sometimes in other countries not elected, to make decisions on how things will go so it's not complete chaos. You need to have maybe a police force that makes things happen. Trash service is really nice. If you've ever been somewhere without trash service, it gets pretty gross quick. So you need things to make a cell work. The organelles are kind of like the things inside the cell that make it work, okay? They're all found in something called the cytoplasm. It's like the gooey, ooey jelly inside. We'll talk about that later. As we're doing the notes, if I underline something, it probably means it's really important. So that's kind of the key things you want to get down. You don't have to copy this word for word. For example, if I was taking notes on this and I knew that I needed to know tiny parts of the cell that do its job, I might just say tiny parts that make cell work. Okay? Shorten that, much easier to write. It'll help you keep up, and it'll be enough where when you look at it, you should be able to remember. And then you can always come back and reference the PowerPoint too. Okay, the first part of the cell we're going to talk about is the cell membrane. We'll also call it the plasma membrane. And so we're specifically now talking about the one that goes on the outside of the cell. This is a plant cell. It has a cell wall too. We'll get to that. But it's this little membrane here, and it holds the cell together. It holds all this fluid, the cytoplasm in here. And also each of these little organelles we haven't named yet but are inside here, they also have a plasma membrane surrounding them. So this structure is found on the outside of the cell and then throughout the cell as well. All cells have a plasma membrane. They have a cell membrane around the outside, so plant, animal, and bacteria. They're made up of something called lipids and proteins, mostly lipids, and lipids are fats. That's going to be our next unit. So you may not know what a lipid is now, but it is a fat, and it surrounds the cell and organelles, and it looks kind of like this. This is a lipid right here, the structure of it, and this is what the cell membrane would look like. It's got 2 layers of these little phospholipids, and it creates this like gelatinous movable piece that helps things go through. Okay, what is the job of the cell membrane? Well, number one, it holds things together, but I like to think of it as the gatekeeper. Okay, so what does a gatekeeper do? It's going to say, hey, you can come in or you can't come in. It's like the bouncer at a club. Up, don't want you here. Up, need you here. So it controls, decides what may enter and exit the cell. So a cell is going to need food. It needs everything you need. A cell is living. You need oxygen. You need water. You need food. All that stuff needs to come through the cell membrane, and the cell membrane decides how much it wants to come in and out. And this also helps with that thing called homeostasis, remember? Maintaining a balance within the cell. The cell membrane is really, really important in that. Okay? Here's my little guy. He's like, you shall not pass, because he is the gatekeeper. Sometimes he might let you pass, or may let some of you in and some of you stay out because we don't need a lot of it at this time, or get rid of some waste. The cell membrane also does another really cool thing. It communicates with other cells. So it has small proteins and something called carbohydrates that stick out of the cell. Here's some examples of it. We call these receptors and stuff. And they stick out of the cell, and then they can have little chemicals come in and be like, hi, I need to say to this cell to do something, and they can communicate with other cells, which is really cool. This is also how viruses like coronavirus are able to get into the cell, is through some of these little communication channels, but they're all on the cell membrane. So one of the jobs is it communicates with other cells, or communicates with other organelles within the cell, which is really kind of an interesting thing. Our second membrane or organelle we will talk about today, which is or part of a cell, is the cell wall. This is only found in plants and fungi. You do not have a cell wall in animals. And the reason is because, well, what can I do? What can you do as an animal? We move really, really well. What allows me to stand up, what keeps me together is my structure, is a skeleton. So I have a skeleton. I have bones and cartilage that give me like structure and form. Plants don't have that. So their structure and form comes from this cell wall. So it's really strong, it's rigid, it's made of something called cellulose. If you think of celery, that is cellulose. I'm pretty sure they call it celery because of cellulose. Really strong stuff that makes up a cell wall, and it makes it really rigid. So if we as animals had cellulose, we'd kind of really be stiff, you know, like a bad comedian. So cell walls give it its shape, and it gives it the structure to plants. So only plants for our purposes have cell walls. Fungus and bacteria do as well, but animals do not have cell walls. Pretty easy one. Here's some pictures of cell walls. We're going to look at these in class. Some of you already have done this. Some of you will do it later. This is a plant cell you find in your fish tank, and you can see the cell wall is really strong on the outside, and you can kind of see the cell membrane. We'll do it with a purple onion, and you'll really see it. Here you can see cell walls really well in cork, and here on a bacteria, which is a prokaryote, you can see cells around the outside. So lots of job. It supports, it protects. So in a city, I would say it's like city walls, you know, like the wall of China to protect your city. Maybe it's the police force. Okay, cytoplasm is the next one we're going to talk about. It's the pink jelly stuff inside a cell. It's the liquid inside a cell. Most of it's water. But what the cytoplasm does is it provides a place for chemical reactions to occur. It's also where all the nutrients and food in the cell is. So it's found in all cells. You can't have a cell without cytoplasm. Some cells, we give it special names. But like I said, it's a jelly-like substance that's surrounded by the cell membrane, and it contains all the water, food, and nutrients for the cell. So when you eat breakfast or lunch or dinner or a snack, your cells actually eventually take that food and put it inside all your cells, and it is stored in this cytoplasm, okay? So cytoplasm, really important. It's where chemical reactions occur. It's how we make food. We're going to talk about some chemical reactions like cellular respiration and photosynthesis. That all occurs in the cytoplasm. Next, we move on to the boss, Bruce Springsteen. No, I meant the boss is in the nucleus. I think you guys have heard about the nucleus before. It is normally the largest organelle within a cell, and it is the control center. So this is like your central government that I talked about in the beginning of a city, controls everything. It is the boss. It tells the other parts of the cell what to do. It tells the cell what to do. It's the instructions for the cell, and those instructions are in the DNA. It also protects the DNA so we're not harmed. Bacteria's DNA just floats around more. It's not as protected, so they do not have a nucleus. So bacteria, I want you to make a big note, do not have a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. Their DNA just floats around freely, much more in danger. We can protect it in here. It's like the library on how to build the cell, and we want to keep that safe, guarded as much as possible. So only in eukaryotes. Okay, kind of works with the nucleus is the ribosome, and the ribosomes are factories. So ribosomes are found in all cells, eukaryotic, prokaryotic. They are everywhere, and they are super important little tiny machines. And their job, we're going to talk about them a lot later in this semester, is where proteins are made. And proteins are like the things that do everything for the cell. And so these are protein factories. So I like to think of the ribosome as like a small factory. Your code from DNA goes through it, and it tells the factory, this is how you build a certain protein. And from that, maybe you get a hair follicle or all kinds of things like the receptors on the cell and everything else. So ribosomes, super important little factories that build proteins. Once our proteins are built within our cell or our factories, we have to have a way to transport them to the rest of the cell. So kind of like a highway system or our road system, maybe a train track. We have the endoplasmic reticulum, really fun, and it really helps move proteins throughout the cell. So it's found only in plants and animals. Bacteria just aren't cool enough. Interesting. So it's going to divide the cell into compartments for transportation, and it transports proteins. So I would think of it like a highway system or your street system within a cell. Okay. Next, we move into the Golgi. We're not going to talk a lot about the Golgi this year, but I want you to have a kind of idea about it. It's very similar to the endoplasmic reticulum you see right here. It's membrane bound, and kind of where this is like the highway system and tells the proteins where to go. Think of Amazon. You buy something from Amazon, they need to distribute it to the rest of the world. The Golgi kind of does this. Or maybe think of proteins, they're like little, they're factories. Your cell phone is made of many different parts, many different proteins in our analogy. And so the screen on your cell phone is probably made in one factory, and the electronics are made in another factory, and the headphones and speakers are in another factory. But we need to put them all together before we get a working cell phone. The Golgi is kind of the place where everything gets put together. Okay, so the Golgi, found in plants and animals, and it modifies and packages proteins for release from the cell. So kind of like an Amazon distribution center, like it's going to put everything together at the last part and then ship it out to the rest of the cell. It also checks to make sure proteins are made correctly and everything else so they don't damage the cell. Like I said, this is pretty advanced biology. You'll learn a lot about that if you ever take bio in college. But for now, I just want you to have a basic idea of what it is. The chloroplast, one of my absolute favorites. And we're actually going to pause there because that's plenty of lecture for this part. So this will end part 1. We'll start with the chloroplast in part 2 of our cell organelles lecture. I'll talk to you guys in the next episode. Might be watching it the same day, might be watching it at different